We would like to begin the online symposium. Thank you very much for participating in the online symposium in celebration of the Centennial of the 19th Amendment, U.S. Women's Voting Rights. I am an MC. My name is Sachiko Kaneko, Director of Fusae Ichikawa Center for Women and Governance. I would like to be an MC for the first part of the program. I would like to start off with my brief greeting and explain the purpose of this symposium. Today, August 26, exactly 100 years ago in the United States. Today, on August 26, women in the United States won the voting right through the constitutional amendment. In Japan, 100 years ago, women were not yet enfranchised. 1 year earlier, in 1919, Fusae Ichikawa founded the New Women's Association with Ryoko Kurihara to campaign for women's political participation. And then in 1921, she went to the United States visiting women's suffragist organization, and she was inspired by them. Returning to Japan, she worked harder for the women's suffrage movement. And as you know very well, she became very active as a politician after the war. Ichikawa Foundation, Ichikawa Center succeeded the suffrage organization Fusae Ichikawa established to pursue women's political education and support their activities. Now, the purpose of the symposium, it's already been informed, so I'll be brief on this. The number of female members of the U.S. Congress reached a record high this year, ranking 82nd in terms of the global House representation, as opposed to 166th place of the Japanese legislature. In the United States, women raised their voices at #MeToo, and the movement spread all over the world. And as you know, the Black Lives Matter movement is on the rise. The issue of discrimination against colored Americans is intensely debated. As for the upcoming U.S. presidential election in November, last month there was Democratic Convention. The very first Black woman, Asian American Kamala Harris, accepted the nomination for vice president. And at the same convention, women raised their voices to promote ERA. The symposium is subtitled with a big question: can women's political participation help overcome a divided society? We set this title because I wanted us to look back on the history in light of the background of today's global situation and think about the current issues together. In support of this objective, the U.S. Embassy joined us as a co-organizer, co-host, and the Society of Promoting Quota System, the International Women's Year Liaison Group Japan, And the National Women's Committee for the United Nations, NGO, also joined us as supporting organizations. I'd like to extend my gratitude to all of them. This online has been supported by U.S. Embassy. Next, I'd like to invite CPAO, the Minister Counselor for Public Affairs of U.S. Embassy, Ms. Carolyn Glassman, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are delighted to be co-hosting this event with the Fusae Ichikawa Center for Women in Governance. I'd like to extend my thanks to our esteemed program participants, Chair Kubo, Director Kaneko, Professors Kurihara and Nakabayashi, and Ms. Sweeney. I'd also like to thank our public affairs team for organizing this program and for our interpreters and their assistance as well. We gather today to celebrate Women's Equality Day, a special day in the U.S. to recognize the 100th anniversary of the landmark passage of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, giving women in the United States the right to vote. Achieving this milestone required a lengthy and difficult struggle, and victory took many decades of agitation. Beginning in the mid-19th century, a diversity of women's suffrage supporters lectured, wrote, marched, lobbied, and practiced civil disobedience to achieve what many Americans considered radical change. But it didn't stop there. For although women of color were active from the earliest beginnings of the suffrage movement, racial inequalities still prevented them from voting. It was not until 1965, thanks to the subsequent generation of activists in the civil rights movement of the 1960s, that the passage of the Voting Rights Act broadened voting rights for all Americans. Thinking of that more recent era, as a child myself growing up in Chicago in the tumultuous 1960s and 70s, I became inspired by activists as well. And so I too dedicated myself to the women's rights movement and protested in support of the Equal Rights Amendment, which was first proposed in 1923 by the suffragists and designed to guarantee equal legal rights for all American citizens, regardless of sex. And although this amendment is still not yet a part of our Constitution in the US, my experience in the women's rights movement inspired me to become a public servant. And were it not for the activists who blazed the trails before me, I would never have had the opportunity to represent my country as an American diplomat. So today we celebrate the successes of these American suffragists and civil rights activists, and we also celebrate the many women around the world, including Japanese suffragists like Fusae Ichikawa, who have fought tirelessly for greater equality in their own countries. I am confident that together, we women, participating with our male allies, can gain new successes in the ongoing struggle for complete gender equality. Let us strive for equal pay, equal treatment, and equal opportunity for all. To achieve this important goal, my colleagues and I look forward to strengthening U.S.-Japan partnerships to ensure that greater equality becomes a reality. Thank you all so much for joining us for this event, and I hope that it will serve as an inspiration to you all.
Thank you.
So we will start the symposium as has been informed. I'd like to introduce our panelists. The moderator is Professor Mieko Nakabayashi, a professor at Waseda University. Politics is her research area. She used to work for the Senate Budget Committee. In 2009, he became a member of the House of Representatives. As a panelist, she will be the third speaker. She will talk about politics, women in politics in Japan. And the very first speaker is Ryoko Kurihara. He teaches at Waseda University and Tokyo Women's University. The feminism movement history is her expertise. She will talk about women's suffrage in the United States. She has written many books in this area. The third, or rather the second speaker is Ms. Melissa Sweeney. She is the chief of the Political Military Affairs Unit of U.S. Embassy. Women's political participation and gender equality will be the topic that she's going to talk about today. She has lived in many different areas of the world. She's quite rich in diverse experiences. After the three presentations, we will have a Q&A session. To close this symposium, I'd like to invite later the chairman of Himiko Kubo of this foundation to close our symposium at 3:45. So I will leave this up to the moderator, Nakabayashi-san, Professor Nakabayashi. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Nakabayashi, Mieko Nakabayashi, as I have been introduced. Today is August 26th, the very day when women won suffrage 100 years ago. So I'm delighted to participate in this symposium. I have goosebumps coming. And it's great to see so many participants. I'm a little nervous. I'm not used to having this kind of virtual program. I may make mistakes, but please bear with me. First, we'll have Professor Kuribayashi and Ms. Sweeney, and then I will make the final presentation. We'll each have 20 minutes or so. After our presentations, we'll have a quick survey. I hope you will participate. So please keep that in mind. So Professor Kuribayashi, please start your presentation.
大丈夫でしょうか、カメラ。はい、お願いします。はい、最初の報告。
Yes, I will be the first speaker. My name is Ryoko Kurihara. I am at the Women's Suffrage Hall, Ichikawa Center. And as you see in the background of this screen, you would see a flag. This is the flag of National Women's Party that actually used up to 1916 up to 1920. This is the actual flag that they used. The leaders of NWP, when they came to Japan, this is given to Fusae Ichikawa Center as a gift. This is a precious gift. Just I wanted to mention this flag in the background. I will be referring to NWP later on in my presentation as well. Personally speaking, this Ichikawa Center is the organization that I'm quite familiar with. In 1985, women's suffrage movement activist Ichikawa set up this center. I came here during my summer vacation to study the resources on women's suffrage activities. I was able to write my master's paper, and very famous journals like Feminist Issues, I was able to submit, post my articles. So I just want to mention that before I start. The women's suffrage movement is something that I studied and I submitted my paper to the graduate school in the United States. But I realized that I was not fully understood the women's suffrage history in the United States. That is why I decided to study more about women's suffrage history in the United States. The pacifist leader Amy Swart Rosen at Sarah Lawrence College is a very famous woman, and that is renowned. A female scholar is my direct teacher. She suggested that I should study women's suffrage activities. So, my presentation. U.S. women's suffrage movement should be studied by asking a question, how that started. There are several theories. There was abolitionist movement in 1830s. The movement actually started even before that, but militant abolition movement accepted women to participate. They accepted women to make public speeches. That started in 1830s. Women's demand equal rights with men as they participated in abolitionist activities, making public speeches. So in a way, this is the origin of the women's suffrage movement in the United States. But many research papers indicated that the origin should be traced back to Seneca Falls Convention, very first women's conference in the world. And they passed 12 resolutions. The last resolution was a demand for the right to vote for women. And during the Seneca Falls Convention, women's voting right became an official agenda. So some do attribute the origin of women's suffrage to the Seneca Falls Convention, 1848, July 1920s. In 1920, the women's suffrage was adopted. So the women's activity started 72 years before that. Now I would like to also explain some of the other activities in the first part of 1800s. In 1865, after the Civil War, the slaves were emancipated. Former slaves, African Americans, were regarded as citizens, so they had to amend the Constitution, adding a new section to the Constitution, taking all persons to be American citizens. And that is basically the 14th Amendment and 15th Amendment. In the 14th Amendment, that reads all persons, including African Americans, are citizens of the United States. However, the Section 2 of the same 14th Amendment refers to specifically male citizens, male inhabitants that appear once in the section, and male citizens that appear twice in the same section. And then 15th Amendment was passed that described the suffrage as part of citizenship. So 14th Amendment and 15th Amendment passed. And after this official beginning of women's suffrage movement, this was symbolized by the establishment of women organizations. There are two organizations. First of all, NWSA, National Women's Suffrage Association, that only accepted women as members. And they advocated the simultaneous granting of voting right to African American men and women. And the other organization is American Women's Suffrage Association, AWSA. They claimed the era for the Black. They strive to achieve the suffrage for African American men first, and then try to achieve women's suffrage later on. So there are differences between the two organizations. However, these two organizations were united in 1890 to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association. This is a complicated story, but going back to the 14th Amendment of Constitution, there was a lot of discussion and debate on this, especially National Women's Suffrage Association presented the new departure theory, saying that when the first section and second section of the same law contradict, the first section should prevail. In the first section of the 14th Amendment, refers to all persons that include women. Women are also persons. In the second section, that specifically specify male citizens, but when the first section prevails and takes precedent, women are already given the right to vote. So that's the theory they presented. They contrived to go to the poll and cast the ballot. When they are rejected, they are actually sued. There is a famous story of Susan Anthony and also Victoria Woodhull, who was also arrested. There were court trials. If time allows, I'd like to give you the stories on these two famous icons. In 1890s up to 1910s, they were having a difficult time to achieve women's suffrage on state level. In 1913, however, Alice Paul, who was a leader of National Women's Party, who has participated in the women's suffrage movement in UK, came back to the United States, tried to renew the women's suffrage movement. There were issues that they faced, of course. In 1913, President Wilson was to be inaugurated, and there was a parade. Alice Paul allowed African American women to participate in the procession, although there was a lot of resistance from white women participants. So from the beginning, there was an issue of racial discrimination. We need to move on further. 1920, women's suffrage was adopted and certified. Immediately before this, there was the World War I. President Wilson did not want to participate in the war because he was a pacifist, but April 3rd, 1917, U.S. decides to go to the war. Having said that, before this decision was made, NOSA decided to support the war in exchange with the women's suffrage. They exchanged letters with President Wilson. NOSA decided to support the war, and then on the other hand, NWP, established by Alice Paul, they actually decided to protest in front of the White House to demand peace and criticize Democratic Party, to be engaged in a lot of protests. Many of the members of the party were arrested, including Alice Paul. Alice Paul criticized President Wilson. So there are differences between these two organizations to the very end. As a result, though, in 1918, President Wilson supported the activities, and in the Federal Congress, the House passed the Women's Suffrage Amendment in 1918, and May 23rd of 1919, in both houses, House and Senate, they passed the amendment. And today, 100 years ago, August 26, the 19th Amendment was certified. As a result, women's suffrage was achieved. Do I still have time? Do I have time? Maybe I moved too quickly. Looks like I still have some time. I did not cover all the stories, but after women's suffrage, the women's suffrage organizations continued on with various activities. It's very hard to summarize. But I'd like to talk about ERA, Equal Rights Amendment. Even during the movement for women's suffrage, there was debate whether we should focus on maternity protection or equality. According to the conventional research, NOSA and NWP, or National League of Women Voters and NWP, are at odds. They were confronting each other. But in the first part of 1920s, there was not a severe division or chasm. Both NLWV, National League of Women's Voters, and NWP both had advocated the support for ERA that included maternal protection. In 1923, ERA amendment bill was submitted to the Federal Congress. NWP and National League of Women Voters, however, drifted apart from each other. NWP focusing more on equality. On the other hand, NLWV were trying to protect motherhood. I guess I'm running short of my time, but lastly, yes, there was a division, that chasm between these two organizations, but there are other women's organizations. Many are national organizations, and there are some severe resistance to their activities. Under such circumstances, they had a very big common factor of trying to achieve equal rights. Up to 1923, their activities had much more commonality than the differences. Now I'd like to close my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kurihara. Thank you for keeping the time. Now, I would like to move on to the next presenter. Ms. Sweeney, are you ready? Please.
Hi, good afternoon. Okay. I'm delighted to join this important program and my very knowledgeable fellow panelists today to discuss with you recent developments in women's political participation in the United States. So following the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, women throughout the United States began to vote for and also run for political office. In recent decades especially, there have been increasing numbers of us seeking public office and participating in elections. But where there has been progress in some areas, such as voter turnout rates and winning seats in state and national legislatures, there has been uneven progress in others, such as the number of female statewide elected executive office holders. Despite progress, we are still underrepresented. The majority of office holders are still male. One thing to bear, speaking of the American experience, is that we are a diverse country, not just in racial and ethnic composition, but in social, political, and economic areas as well. As such, women's political participation varies by area, state, and region. And within the vote, there is statistical variation across racial and ethnic groups, with voter turnout higher among African American and non-Hispanic white women than among Hispanic and Asian women. Voting rates also vary among age groups, with fewer younger women voting than older women. So women do not necessarily vote as a cohesive, unified bloc. There is great variation in thought, opinions, values, and issues that are important to us. So since the passage of the 19th Amendment, women have made significant gains in achieving elected offices at the state and the national levels. However, despite advances over the past decades, progress has stalled in recent years. Today, in 2020, there are 127 female members of the U.S. Congress. While this is the highest percentage in our history ever, women legislators still only account for a mere 23.7% of the 535 members. If we continue at the historical rate of progress since 1960, by some calculations, it will take us until the year 2117 to gain 50% of the seats. That's another 97 years after the 100 years of progress that we have had to date. The underrepresentation of women in Congress is reflected in state legislatures as well. In some states' legislatures, the share of seats held by women are above 30%, while in other states it remains under 3%. And the share of women office holders in elected executive office position also varies by state. The percentage of women of color in elected office, both national and state, is significantly lower than the representation in the general population. So why is this? It's not because we don't vote. We are considerably more active voters than men. More women are registered to vote and actually do go to the polls to vote than men in the United States. Since 1980, women voters outnumber men in presidential elections. Our voices matter, and we can have a significant influence on the selection of candidates. So if more women turn up to vote, why is it that there is a persistent gender gap in our representation at all levels of government? A 2018 Pew Research Center survey found that the majority of Americans surveyed said they would like to see more women in top leadership positions in politics. A majority also think that men have an easier path to political leadership positions and that women have to work harder than our male counterparts to prove ourselves. Half of the surveyed cited gender discrimination as a major reason that women continue to be underrepresented in politics. Of course, there is variation between the sexes with a clear gender gap. Women are more likely than men to think that there are too few women in these positions, and we are far more likely than men to see structural barriers and uneven expectations presenting obstacles to women achieving these positions. Studies show that a women candidate is as similarly as likely to be elected as a man. They get elected at the same rate. But part of our problem, we run for office less often than men. We are less likely than men to put ourselves forward for elected office. There are many factors which may influence this decision. Family and educational background, and occupational choices may have an impact. Cultural and institutional constraints from birth affect perceptions and expectations about our futures and roles in society. Stereotypes not only affect how we evaluate others, but also how we evaluate ourselves and our performance of tasks that are typically associated with one gender. So it's therefore important to increase recruitment of women candidates and encourage us to run for elected office at all levels of government. Training for women on running a campaign can also have an important impact. Another constraint is a lack of access to traditionally male political networks and fundraising, which is essential to support a candidacy. Also, given the disproportionate childcare and household burdens on women, the lack of childcare, paid maternity leave, etc., can also be a challenge and a disincentive to run for office. Strengthening networks of women's organizations to support female candidates can also expand their political and fundraising networks and support during campaigning. In addition to the constraints female candidates having less access to resources and support, there's also the issue of the unfortunate women's electability. Women candidates are often held to a different standard than men candidates. Discussion of female candidates sometimes focuses on a woman's electability and likability, which are not typically topics of discussion for male candidates. There's greater focus on women's personal lives and physical appearance, and as well their credentials and qualifications for the positions. For example, during Hillary Clinton's presidential candidacy, there was intense scrutiny of her fashion choices, namely her fondness for the pantsuit, which was criticized for not being sufficiently feminine. Our personality traits are also judged differently than men's. A survey found that 74% of women said that being assertive mostly helps a man's chance of getting elected to high political office. Only half of all adults say it helps women. 23% even said that being assertive mostly hurts women in politics, compared with just 5% who say this about men. This sexist treatment may be a contributing factor which discourages women for office. And this negative portrayal of a female's characteristics has also been shown to have an impact on both male and female voters' views of the candidate, affecting her likability. Since the passage of the 19th Amendment, there has been steady progress in expanding women's political participation in the United States. Universal suffrage for women laid the foundation for subsequent anti-discrimination policies in fields that have and are profoundly influencing our society and culture, affecting and changing women's expectations for themselves and society's expectations of us. I have been encouraged over the course of my lifetime by the increasing opportunities for women and seeing the increasing number of women being elected to public office. That said, women remain underrepresented at all levels of government, and we as a society need to do more to encourage women to run for office, barriers that discourage us from doing so. Key to this is to recruit, train, and support women candidates. Women's engagement in the political process is essential to representatives of women and address a diverse range of political, economic, and social issues affecting our society. Our participation strengthens democracy by bringing diverse perspectives and experiences, which is essential to a vibrant, healthy democracy and fostering strong, resilient communities. And that concludes my, thank you for your time.
Ms. Sweeney, is that the end of your presentation?
Yes, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Very detailed presentation. Our time is limited, so let's move on to my presentation, third presentation.
There were questions on ERA. What is ERA? Equal Rights Amendment. So ERA, Equal Rights Amendment in the United States, that is trying to revise the U.S. Constitution to ensure gender equality. The movement started many years ago after the women's suffrage adopted. They actually shifted the activities to ERA. However, as time passed, the reasons for demanding ERA was diluted in 1982. This was stopped, although there are many women organizations that are continued on their path of achieving equal rights. I will be referring to that in my presentation just briefly. 14th Amendment, that is the civil rights, to try to eliminate gender inequality. This is the constitutional interpretation presented by the Supreme Court that is now included in the 14th Amendment. And that is one of the other reasons that weaken the movement for ERA. 35 states of the United States had to ratify ERA, but they were not able to complete the state level ratification. So in 1982, this was not adopted. The women now have the rights to vote, but they will not achieve this ERA. And as they plan for future activities under many different Supreme Court rulings and decisions made by different courts, all of those decisions were made based on laws. If women are involved with the process of making laws, legislative process, they will be able to change the whole society. So the federal Congress, that is the federal level legislature, that is where laws are created and amended. If there are more women involved in this process, there will be a major impact on society. So that was the focus of the future, the later movements of women. As you can see on this next slide, or in the background of myself, you would see the map. This is a map created based on IPU, Inter-Parliamentary Union statistics, created by UN Women. This shows the global map of female representation in parliament. Red areas are in the middle ranking group. The countries that belong to blue box tend to have higher women representation in their parliament. Yellow group have smaller number of female women legislative representation. The font is too small, but I think the colors are easier to understand. The United States is right in the middle group, the red color group. You might be surprised. The United States is the democratic leader of the world. Now, Japan is far back in the yellow group, in the yellow color range, showing that Japan is in the lower ranking group. By looking at this ranking in the form of table, I realized that some of the countries that are ranked on top have quota. I actually made a table of what countries had quota systems. I was looking for what I studied, but it looks like I have deleted all the tables that I created in late at night. But one thing I can say for sure is many countries that have a compulsory quota system are ranked very high in terms of women's representation. In 2018, in Mexico passed a law to introduce quota, the reserved seats for women. And then I noticed later on, Mexico moved up in the ranking, going to the top because of the quota system being introduced. Rwanda actually have a quota described in its constitution. Some countries do have laws describing a quota. Some parties do have their party rules to reserve seats for women. Some sort of party rules or other regulations can be introduced. There are many different forms of quota. A Mexican example is obvious how the quota system can contribute to increasing the female participation in politics. Today, we celebrate the centennial of the women's suffrage in the United States. So I'd like to compare the US and Japan. Both of the countries do not have the quota system. In Japan, we are trying to increase the number of women members in the Diet, but it's not compulsory. We have just started our efforts. There is no party rules in the United States that regulates the need of having this quota system. So when you want to introduce women, there will be other groups wanting to have LGBT or Hispanics representation in the federal Congress. So that may be another reason why the US is reluctant to introduce the quota system. It may be hard for the US to have the quota system in place. Now, if you look at this next graph, even without the quota system, the US is far ahead of Japan. It is making effort to try to send more women members of the legislature because it is the legislature that is making laws. And they have this recognition that they have to have more women involved in legislative process. And this is the graph that I created using Excel. Especially in recent years, the gap between the two countries is expanding. Even without the quota, how is that the US was able to increase the number of women members in the Congress? In 1992, was often referred to as the year of the women. The mid-year election of this year was a tipping point. There was a sexual harassment scandal, which was often talked about in hearings. The Judicial Committee was criticized as well for the lack of care. And even before that, in 1982, ERA failed. But after that, women organizations were trying to recruit women to run for the legislature. That will be a new stage for women's activities. So after the year of the women, 1992, it didn't take too many years. They were able to increase the number of women in the federal Congress. And then there was a sexual harassment scandal that actually rapidly increased the number of women in the Congress. Women were able to raise their voices then, If you look at this table, then why do we have to have women in the Congress? There is a civil society in the background. Of course, it was women that started activities, but they involved men as well and continued on the path that set out. Of course, they have come through this path with a lot of pains and difficulties. But women were able to involve men in civil society to support their activities. When ERA failed, up to 1992, increasing number of organizations was set up to support women. You see a list. We have an old standing organizations up to more recent ones. How many of these organizations supporting women candidates? Do you know how many of these exist in the United States on the local level, the state level, and the federal level? I think you will be surprised. At Waseda University, when I teach, I talk about women in politics. I focus on the United States and always give the same homework to students, making an Excel table that lists up the number of organizations, political stance, and the funds raising. I asked students to come up with as many organizations as possible in the United States supporting women, and also do the same for Japan as well. So each one of my students will come up with 2 lists. For the United States, they will have so many listed, but in Japan, the list will be very short. There are only a few limited number of organizations that support women candidacy. If you study, you will be surprised how different both of our countries are in terms of the support that is available for women. You see this list that starts with Emily's list. Yes, there is a problem in the United States. That is not a problem in Japan. That's abortion. This is a dividing political issue, and women is right in the middle. They are always faced in a deep, difficult dilemma. And I believe this caused a lot of pain to women candidates in the United States. That is not in Japan. Pro-life Republican candidates tend to have less number of organizations supporting her, even though with the organization support, they will have to win in the primary election. They may stand less chance of winning the primary because of receiving supports from pro-choice women supporting organizations. So many of the Republican women candidates are having a hard time, and they are in a dilemma. And then if you look at this graph, if you look at women in the federal Congress, obviously you have many more Democratic women than Republican women in Congress. From Japanese point of view, we tend to take the United States as a consistent group. But if you look closer, a surprising difference emerges. Obviously, women in the Republican Party are having a hard time. They were torn between pro-life and pro-choice. The women candidates from the Republicans, again, are having a hard time because the party itself is pro-life and opposing pro-choice. So the Republican women in Congress are much less than Democrats. And women voters tend to vote for the Democrats as well. This shows the 2018 midterm elections exit poll. The data clearly shows that 51% of men voted for the Republicans and 47% of men voted for the Democrat. For women, 59% of women voted for the Democratic Party, 40% for the Republican Party. As Ms. Sweeney mentioned in her presentation, there are more women going to the poll. Women are more willing to cast ballot than men. And women often choose to vote for women candidates. Especially this was clear in the last midterm election, according to the data. So that's the background of civil society in the United States. Even without the quota system, the U.S. was successful in increasing the number of women representation in the legislature. When I talk to young students, I would always make sure that I would ask, why do we need women representation? Why do we have to have women members of the parliament to reform the society? It doesn't have to be women to represent women's interests. For example, if you look at a Japanese constituency, there are many members who are elected, but they represent a full constituency. Half of that is women, and they are elected due to a passionate support of these women, half of the constituency. And some would say that, what is the problem with this? It doesn't matter if it's men or women. It is true, they can represent women's interests. However, this is the US research, although this is rather old. I'd like to introduce this data, the research data. Legislative system in the United States is different from Japanese parliamentary system, where there are party constraints on individual members of the parliament. It is quite a bit difficult for an individual, a member of the parliament, to present a bill. But US have clear separate powers under the presidency, legislature. The Congress is in charge of making laws, and just one single member of the Congress can actually submit a bill and vote freely, free of the constraints of the parties that they belong to. So it's basically roll call. So basically, you know exactly who voted for what. In civil society, NPOs will disclose data to voters. The data of voting when it's disclosed, voters will be able to examine the data to try to understand the tendency of policies that an individual member of the Congress supports. That is possible. The data can be quite insightful. For example, the abortion issue or environmental issue, the Clean Water Act, can be examined with data. As a matter of fact, there is clear gender difference, distinctive difference between the two genders on these policy issues. It's not the policy difference, it's the gender difference. So depending on the types of policies, you would see a clear, distinctive differences of the genders. Women, therefore, can cooperate with each other. Bipartisan cooperation is possible. And this has been fully researched by scholars, and it seems that there are data that prove the women's cooperation has been effective. People say that the U.S. is divided today, but women can cooperate on specific issues and agenda. They will be able to build a bridge over this division. Women are not as constrained by party policies as men. However, since 2008, Tea Party movement began. In the primary elections, women were unlikely to win, especially in the Republican primary elections. It seems that only conservative women will be able to win the primary. The neutral women are having a hard time. My colleague is also running the campaign. Susan Collin is also having a hard time. We are hoping that the women Democrats and female Republicans can cooperate together, because the United States is a model of democracy to Japan. There is much we can learn from the United States. And as you can see on this next slide, similarly, there is a gender difference depending on the policy issues. For example, NIH was not spending sufficiently on diseases that are specific to women, and they presented this bill to increase the government expenditure on NIH to study them. So amendments, drafts, and bills are actually presented actively in the American Congress. During their tenure, there are multiple bills that they are asked to vote for. Some of the bills may be neglected by members, but if they are important issues to women, women will be able to deal with them and vote for it. In Japan, we still have underrepresentation. Often there is an argument that men can represent women's interest. Having said that, I'd like to point out how women can contribute to the national diet. We have a declining childbirth. Rapidly, birth rate is declining in Japan. And if you look at the Japanese welfare and social structures that are heavily affected by democracy, child rearing or nursing care to elderly people are very important policy issues that women can advocate, and this is demanded by the society today. Before I conclude, I'd like to explain how Japan can learn from the United States. The American women's suffrage achieved 100 years ago. It's the activities of women that we can learn from. It's the women who started the movement. It was women who tried to do the fundraising and recruit candidates who will be able to win in the primary election. It was women who are able to raise funds, try to find electable women candidates through tactics. We have parliamentary system, strategies and tactics must be changed, but the basics are the same. It's the civil force and NPOs. We have NPO laws in place. There are multiple civil groups today in Japan who can be more active. Many citizens are have this mentality that they don't want to be involved with the politics. But traditionally, it's the women who can actually encourage men to participate in the same movement. Unfortunately, in Japan, we still have political parties that have dominance over individual members of the parliament. We do not have as many women who can truly represent women's interests. So we have to have women leading this way. There are a lot of things that Japan can learn from the United States. First is the civil society. And the other lesson that we can learn is to have transparent legislative process that should be disclosed to citizens to understand who is doing what policies has been promoted by who. It's the data that is completely non-existent in Japan. And I believe this is quite important for women's political participation. So that concludes my presentation.
Thank you very much, everyone, for participating today. Professor Nakabayashi encouraged us to continue our movement. We are celebrating Centennial. Japan is celebrating 75th year this year, so we still have 25 more years to go before the Centennial. Sorry, I'm having trouble with the video. Sorry. So our discussion should not end here. This is only the beginning. So I would like to mention just 2 points. Some people have pointed out that women's suffrage was given to us in Japan. Maybe that might be true. We lost the war, and I think the women's suffrage process was kind of accelerated. But as you saw the flag, we already had women's suffrage movement in Japan. We already had the domestic movement going on, and Ms. Ishikawa reminded us that every time. And she also mentioned that women's suffrage is the key. That's what she used to say. 75 years ago, Japanese women won this right. And thus we should participate in politics. And we have to make a better society. So we would like to continue working together for a better society. Thank you very much for your participation. And we have a very short survey at the end. So hope you will participate until the end. Thank you very much.